evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled The Environmental Impact of World War I. I'm joined by Tate Keller. Tate is the Associate Professor and Chair of History at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. He's also a past fellow at the National Humanities Center. He was with us for the year 2018-19. Today is April 14th, 2022. So pleased that you could join us. This is Andy Mink, Vice President of Education Programs at the Center. On behalf of Jira and Mike and Meredith, we want to give all of you a particularly strong high five tonight because we know that this is either spring break for some of you. Many of you, you're coming off of spring break. You're looking forward to spring break. This is a difficult time in education because the weather is turning nice for those of us who don't live in constant sunshine. Students are starting to see the end of the year, as are many of you as teachers. There's an academic rhythm that you're starting to feel wind down. We very much appreciate you joining us and continuing your professional growth and learning around topics like tonight's. In particular, I want to note some of the new and returning guests in our room tonight. If you can look around, give them a wave, catch their eye. William, it's great to see you here. William is from Illinois. Emily, is always nice to see you, Emily. It seems like you're in every single webinar, and I noticed that you were at our medical humanities conference earlier today. Emily is in Columbia, Maryland, in Anne Arundel Public Schools. Jacqueline over in Ohio, it's always great to see you as well. Douglas, I got your voicemail, but I didn't have your email, so it was difficult for me to reach back out when I finally got it about signing up for tonight's webinar, but I see you figured it out. Douglas is in North Carolina, and I'm very glad that you're with us. Lee is at Silver High School in New Mexico. Jason is at the St. Louis Public Library. Maureen's down in Florida, and as always, we have lots of Los Angeles Unified teachers: Gary, Phil, Angelo, Kathleen. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and representing. The one person I do want to particularly note, though, Francis, I see you're in the airport in Denver. Francis is from South Dakota. But Melissa, you're joining us from France tonight. Melissa is a teacher in, I believe, in Southern California and is on spring break in France. So what is it, probably after midnight there. And I suspect that you will, after learning a lot of what we said tonight, I hope you find your way over to the Bastogne area or Verdun down in the Benelux triangle there, and you can perhaps see some of the things that we'll be discussing. The center, much like you and your schools and classes, is also feeling its academic cylinder turn. The fellows are working furiously as they feel the end of the spring semester start to wind down, and the work that they want to accomplish still piled up in front of them. But one thing that I do notice from most of the projects, and I think it might include Professor Keller's talk tonight, is this notion of looking at traditional narratives or conventional understandings from a different perspective. The past is not a facsimile. We don't have a snapshot of it that we can just look at. We're constantly trying to reassemble it and reanimate it and add new and interesting perspectives and puzzle pieces to better understand these events and these people and the choices that people make in the first person on a daily basis. And so being able to see from many different sides, using all the humanities disciplines is really at the heart of what happens at the center. All of that work and the work we do in education is found in the Humanities in Class digital library. Please do use this resource often and regularly in your curriculum planning. You can trust that it's rigorous and high quality material. You can also trust it's free and will always be so. You can also trust that it has a Creative Commons license that allows you to use it in an open fashion. And we hope you find that to be helpful. That does include resources and readings that Professor Keller has pulled together for you in advance of tonight's session. Again, you guys are busy folks, so you may not have really consumed them before tonight's session, but I do hope you find them valuable in reflection on what you learned tonight, and perhaps by going back over the recordings and giving yourself a little bit more context for what we'll do. The digital library is not only a place for the National Humanities Center to make its work available, but we also are fortunate to work with nearly 100 other humanities organizations. These are organizations of all sizes and locations and disciplines. And I'm really pleased tonight to welcome Jennifer Cottle, who is going to share some of the resources that the Macarthur Memorial Museum in Norfolk, Virginia makes available. Hey, Jennifer, can you hear me over in Tidewater?
Yes, I can, Andy. Thank you. Yeah, hi. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk tonight. I'm subbing in for our education manager, Amanda Williams. She just welcomed her second child over the weekend, so I offered to step in for the presentation tonight. Thank you guys for having me. As Andy said, my name's Jennifer Cottle. I'm one of the museum attendants, and I also help out with the education programs at the Macarthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. And I'm just going to share some brief information about the memorial and the education programs we have to offer. The memorial is a museum and a research center dedicated to preserving and presenting the life of General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. The memorial also pays tribute to the millions of men and women who served with General MacArthur in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. We're located in downtown Norfolk, Virginia, and we have a museum, an archive, a research center, education center. We also have a theater, a welcome center, and a gift shop. If anyone's ever in the area, our admission is always free, just like our education programs and all of our resources. Speaking of our education programs, we reach about 100,000 people a year with our educational resources. Our mission is primarily to conserve the artifacts and historical resources in our collection and making those items and those stories available to a wider audience. Education plays a major role in that, and we work very hard to ensure that both students and teachers can encounter history in interesting ways, whether it's in person or virtually. For those that are local to our area, we do have a number of both on-site and outreach programs available. One of our most popular education programs is our Traveling Footlocker, which is a footlocker that you can rent out to your school, and it has artifacts and reproductions that students can actually touch and learn about a little more tactily. You can find more information about those Traveling Footlockers on our website. For those of you located a little further afield, we do offer a number of virtual resources as well as activities on our website, also on our YouTube channel. And we also have two podcast series that we do. One focuses on the life and history of MacArthur from the 1860s to his death in 1964. And our second one is our World War I podcast, which focuses on a wide variety of World War I topics. We try to take a very interdisciplinary approach to our programming. One particular resource we currently have available that relates to tonight's theme is our latest World War I podcast episode, which features an interview with tonight's presenter, Dr. Keller. Again, these resources are free. You can find them online at macarthurmemorial.org or by searching for MacArthur Memorial on your favorite podcast platform. And just as a quick final note, General Douglas MacArthur is a very controversial figure in American history. Lots of people love him, lots of people hate him. Understanding that perspective is a big part of our institutional culture. Some people might see controversy as a disadvantage. We try to use it as an advantage and as something that enhances what we can bring to educators and to students. History's messy, people are complicated. But by developing critical thinking skills, research skills, and learning how to interrogate primary sources, we all become better students of our past and better citizens. Thank you again for having me tonight. We love working with educators. If there's something we can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. Thank you very much again.
Jennifer, thank you so much. Please give our regards to Amanda and the new addition to her family. As someone who grew up in Tidewater, I used to go to the Macarthur Memorial Museum as a fourth grader, and I can remember the field trips vividly. It was a wonderful experience, and I suspect that the digital assets that folks all around the country can access are going to be equally valuable. Thank you again, Jennifer. So it's hard to believe, folks, we've spent a lot of time together since late last August. We've only got 4 webinars left. I do hope that you consider joining us for any one of these 4 upcoming sessions. I also encourage you to share these with your departments and your colleagues, your network. These will be fantastic sessions, and we will continue running them as we have been. And then next year's schedule will be released in early May. We'll be opening registration in mid-August. Last thing I'll mention is a deep, heartfelt thanks to all of our teacher advisory council members, both past and current. I see you, Ginger Park, out in Fort Collins. We were fortunate to be able to welcome this year's cohort to Durham just last week and really enjoyed getting to know them, understanding better what life is like right now in their classrooms as they engage their curriculum and do their best to shepherd their students through this very disruptive time that we're living in. I would love for all of you who spend regular time with us in our webinars to maybe have a more official relationship with us and apply for the TAC. We're accepting applications until April 29th. Please go to our website and take a look at the application process, and we would love to receive that in the next couple of weeks. Finally, it is your contributions, your questions, your chatter, your formal probing that's going to make tonight's webinar really sing. Please do continue to use the audience chat. Also use the Ask the Professor tab to submit formal questions. What I'll do as the moderator is bring those to Professor Keller on occasion. So once again, you have joined us for the Humanities Class webinar titled The Environmental Impact of World War I. I'm very pleased to be joined by Professor Tate Keller. Professor Keller is an associate professor and chair of history at Rhodes College, as well as a past fellow at the National Humanities Center. I also want to thank Brian Sheehy for being with us tonight. Brian is our TA. He's a history teacher at North Andover High School in North Andover, Massachusetts. He's also a wonderful World War I scholar and curriculum writer. So Brian's going to be in the chat box, sharing ideas and generally keeping the conversation lively. Hey, Tate, can you hear me over in Memphis?
Hey, Andy, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining. It's wonderful to hear your voice again. Before I turn over the reins to the PowerPoint and you walk us through the research that you've done, I've got a couple of questions for you that I'd like to start with.
Okay.
And one of them is a little bit more in depth than the other, so I'm going to start with that one. I suspect that in most places in the United States, public schools, let's just start with public school standards and curriculum and sort of the general expectations of what we teach in U.S. history. I bet World War I might well be the most important, most high impact event in the history of this country that is taught the least. Why is that? Why do Americans not teach World War I?
I agree. And I think one of the reasons is because it gets so overshadowed by the Second World War, which is a consequence of the First World War. But the Second World War, in a lot of, our sort of a cultural memory of it is known as the Good War. There we are, we're fighting against evil Nazis sort of thing. And there's something that seems far more fascinating about it. Compared to the First World War, the Americans, that is, join in towards the tail end. So it doesn't seem to have quite the same sort of memory as the Second World War does.
Yeah, I suspect that you're right. And in my own time spending in France and Belgium, these other places, Germany, boy, World War I is fresh on their mind, and it always surprises me as an American that because it's not here, and that's something I bet we cover and get into a little bit tonight. Here's the next question. This is a short, quick question. I'd like you to solve a little bit of a debate that was recently held with our Teacher Advisory Council. Actually, should we call this World War I or the First World War?
Oh.
Where do you fall on that?
I think I use both in my scholarship, so I guess I don't take a side. I go back and forth.
Very cagey. I appreciate it, but we definitely had some folks with strong opinions. Maybe we'll continue that throughout the night. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. You can advance the slides at your own pace. As the moderator, I'll bring you questions. We're really looking forward to you sharing your work.
Great. Thank you so much. And I want to start off by saying thank you to everyone over at the National Humanities Center. I miss you all, something terrible, but especially to Andy and to Jera for getting this all lined up and being so patient with me and getting my materials to you. And thanks to everyone out in the audience. I'm eager to take questions and answer them as they come. I'm going to talk today about my book research that I've been working on for the past few years, which is looking at a global environmental history of the First World War. And my work in particular focuses on energy geopolitics. I'm especially interested in natural resource extraction and how the battle lines and the home fronts were linked with industry and agriculture that fundamentally shaped the 20th century. If we think about it, that we see in environmental terms, few human endeavors have altered the natural world in the modern era as much as agriculture, industry, and warfare. And in 1914, the three formed a violent triad that was geared towards the production of destruction. But to start forward and kind of work my way backwards, when we tend to think about environmental impacts of the war, at least most recently, we think about how we've entered into the nuclear era. Or if we consider, here's some images from Vietnam that we can still see some of the shell holes in these rice paddies, or the lasting impacts of Operation Ranch Hand when they used Agent Orange and a variety of other chemicals as defoliants. And I think I saw somewhere mentioned in the comments about the war in Kuwait when the Iraqi forces set so many of those oil wells on fire and the impact that had. We tend to first think of battlefields when we think about environmental impacts of the war, like iconic images from the Western Front, fighting against the elements, mud, climate, rats, lice, disease. In Mesopotamia, there's a group of British soldiers who frequently suffered heat strokes. That furnace-like setting there in the desert made for a hotbed of disease. The English soldiers suffered something they called Baghdad boils, which I don't know what those are, but they sound horrible. In Africa, where the war was also taking place, there's issues with disease, wild animal attacks, fighting that's happening in the Alps during the First World War. Soldiers are suffering from frostbite, avalanches, hypothermia. There's a sense of isolation that came from being up on the mountains. Really, no surprise with that list. Also, significant depression. Armies did alter ecosystems on every fighting front. And in many ways, at least to my mind, the warfare that we see happening in 1914 through 1918 accelerated environmental change that had already begun in the previous century. So if we look back and we think about soldiers in Mesopotamia, the most pressing problem for them was water, which given the arid environment, that would probably seem pretty obvious. But what might surprise us for troops was the issue not of too much water, but it was an overabundance of water, especially during the flood seasons, those marshlands and shallow ponds that dotted the alluvial plains there. Snowmelt in the highlands of Asia Minor swelled the rivers and lakes below, which burst their banks and turned all of lower Mesopotamia into morass. So to prevent wholesale inundation, local civilians traditionally had piled heaps of loose dirt along the banks, but strong rivers pretty much swiped those away. But combatants further altered the land with trenches, protective dams. They changed water flows. They redirected the course of rivers. For those armies that were fighting up in the Alps, they intensified the industrialization on the heights with the expansion of roads, railways, trails, telephones like we see here in this image. Guerrilla warfare in East Africa likewise expanded infrastructure, but also we find that the war there contributed to widespread famine across the continent. But as we might guess, nowhere was the concentration of forces so great as on the Western Front, where the stalemate there ensured economic upheaval. Scenes of utter devastation, ruined landscapes, pitted and cracked with craters, trenches, these quickly became a metaphor for the great wars waste. Opposing forces along the Western Front fired over 1 billion shells at each other. And now these relics form a lethal substratum of the soil and still today are continuing to make their way back to the surface. So in a lot of ways, these hidden armaments still haunt the land, these rusting devices that still maim and still murder. Here's an image from a couple years ago from a Belgium agency. These guys are charged with getting rid of these old armaments. It's pretty commonplace for farmers to dig these things up. They often call it the iron harvest. And occasionally bombs that get caught in tractor plows explode, claiming more victims for the war. Some regions are so saturated with these hidden shells that they're designated as red zones, places that are too dangerous for cultivation or tourism or human habitation. So the destruction on the Western Front dominates the scholarship on the war and has also shaped our views of the conflict's ecological impact. It also dominates how most people will think about the war in terms of the combatants. That is to say, white Europeans in their 20s, often university educated. We might think of those poets and writers like Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon, Vera Brittain, Robert Graves. But if we extend our gaze beyond the front lines, we find that while the battlegrounds certainly suffered from those storms of steel, major damage to nature was relatively short-lived along the Western Front. Here's an image from today of what were once trenches and devastated landscapes. So paradoxically, in my findings, greater environmental change occurred behind the lines, away from the killing fields. So contrary to popular memory, the lands that suffered the most stood pretty far from the fighting. I tend to think of armies in the First World War as both social entities, which many historians have, of course, studied armies as social entities, but biological entities as well. And these biological entities depended on a military ecology, so to speak, energy extraction, production, and supply to function. So to maintain the biological welfare of soldiers and to keep engines of war in action, states commandeered natural resources throughout the biosphere, thus expanding the war's environmental footprint. So that's my grand introduction to all of this. And what I'll do from here is I'll offer some different examples of how that's looked and what I've uncovered. And some of these examples I reference in that article, one of the articles that I sent along as well. So,
Professor, before we move on, I've got a couple of questions I'd like to bring to you from the audience.
Oh, great.
These are just short, clarifying questions. Let's see, if you go back to, looking for the slide with the lined up, there it is. So on this slide, Lisa's in Illinois, asks, you mentioned that, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit for you, Lisa. She asks that you mentioned that there are shells, in some cases live shells, still in the ground all across the battle zones of World War I. On occasion, somebody digs them up, they explode. Do they actually count that death as part of the casualty numbers for World War I?
No, I don't think they do anymore.
Okay.
Not in terms of casualty numbers, no. But yeah, these shells are constantly dug up, and then what farmers do is they just simply set them at the side of the road. Yeah. And then these demining agencies, these guys come along, they pick up the shells, and it goes through a pretty rigorous test to find out what sort of shell it is, what might be inside of it, and whether it could still go off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is a similar question. It comes from Monica in nearby Durham. Monica wonders, in America, we have some battlefields, certainly not to the extent that there are in Europe, but our battlefields are pristine. They are clean. They are, used for public history purposes. Again, I'm paraphrasing for Monica, but why didn't they clean all this up? They've had 100 years. Why is all this stuff still in? Why is the shells, the masks, the casings, the barbed wire, the shovels, why are those things still in the ground?
Yeah, it's just the sheer number of it all.
Yeah.
The citation of billions of shells wasn't really that much of an exaggeration. It was an extensive amount of armaments that were being shot back and forth at each other. I think I read some estimate somewhere talking about cleaning up those shells, and that's simply from the First World War, of taking 100, 200 years, a significant amount of time, just because of the amount.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll move on back to where you left off. I think it was on slide 40, and continue. Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks so much for those questions. I really appreciate them. When I was thinking about energy sources, because there has to be some sort of energy behind firing all those shells, initially in 1914, it was coal. Coal was the principal source of industrial energy. And so in the attempt to offset shortages, there's tremendous concern among governments, all the belligerent governments, about offsetting shortages. Governments started rationing coal or otherwise encouraged citizens to conserve it. So this poster you see right here came out of Great Britain, and it's giving advice to folks on how they should themselves conserve coal by using the amount normally in their fist. Or, in some places, they said, burn wood instead, save the coal. What we find, though, is that the First World War taxed timber reserves around the world. As a result, deforestation accelerated, but in a pretty uneven fashion. In Great Britain, they suffered an acute timber crisis. They cut down nearly half of their productive forests, over 450,000 acres worth. With the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914, that lowered the cost of exports from Vancouver heading over to Europe. So soon, British Columbia became Canada's leading timber exporter, where most of Europe began receiving their lumber from the northwest of Canada and the United States. Here we see an image from Washington State. And what I always find so notable, and if you could see like the little people and horses in there to give us a sense of size here. And I was always struck when I look at these images of how similar I find them to be to war zones, which is something I'll come back towards the end of my talk. French and German timber stands actually fared much better during the war than we might expect, mostly because of institutionalized forestry practices that go back to the early 19th and even into the 18th century. Now, on top of that, most of the manpower had been diverted to the armies. We did have American troops, that 10th and 20th Engineering Corps, that were foresters, and they when they first arrived over there, they took to the forests in western France with heavy cutting to supply the lumber needed for the war effort. And if we could think about all the things that wood's needed for, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You need it for housing, for creating, for timber pits, for coal pits that you need this timber wood. You need it for any sort of barracks that you're going to have. It's just extensive. What we find, though, coming out of this war is, particularly in Great Britain and the United States, is the development of forest policy. We find that the generals who had come back from the war and see these clear-cut areas become alarmed, thinking about, well, this is a natural resource that we need for the war effort, so we have to think of ways to conserve it. And so we find these mixed messages that come across about both extracting these resources in all kinds of ways, this cute little poster here with the beaver, or when manpower was at such a shortage, there'd be a call for women to now serve as lumberjills, so to speak, or expansive industrialized timber extraction, leaving landscapes like this, which is what generals were looking at, logistic officers coming back, and then starting to approach lawmakers and policymakers for policy to conserve these natural resources. As the war went on, there was a shift from coal to oil. So the war accentuated the importance of petroleum, and this is where Mexico and the United States really played a pivotal role. At that time, the US and Mexico provided more than 80% of the world's petroleum. Most of it's coming out of the Gulf Coast region here in Gulf of Mexico. And it was especially devastating the oil extraction here happening along the Gulf of Mexico coast. The oil there tends to be much hotter coming out of the ground. It has much higher levels of hydrogen sulfides. If not taken care of properly, it can lead to explosions that would blow across the land, just like you might see on the Western Front. Dependency on the U.S. oil and Mexican oil was especially a big concern in Great Britain, where we find discussions, worries about dependency on foreign oil, which also drove British ambitions in Mesopotamia. But really, the crucial energy source was food. Food security was a defining feature of the war. Countries blockaded by the British and French navies, namely Germany and the Ottoman Empire, faced alarming energy deficits, which required authoritarian regulations. From an environmental standpoint, it's not surprising that Germany lost. What is shocking is that it sustained over 1.7 million soldiers on multiple fronts for over 4 years, as long as it did. So Germany's eventual defeat revealed the ecological constraints of waging war. Germans imported about 25% of their food, including eggs, dairy products, vegetable oils, fish, meat. Much of the fodder consumed by German farm animals came from Russia, Argentina, and the United States. So with British blockades and poor domestic harvests, German agricultural production plummeted. And we see these propaganda pieces coming out. So it's meant to be a potato, and the Durchhalten at the top is hold out. And at the bottom it says, though we might be surrounded, we Germans will hold out. We will mobilize every potato. I always see like a little face when I look at that, but it could be because I've been looking at it for so long. So desperate to increase their agricultural output, Germans would plow up churchyards, they plow up school grounds, they plowed up any sort of forest glade that looks like it could grow anything. It got to the point where they would even plow up the soccer fields, which was alarming for a lot of people there. Food shortages also exacerbated class tensions. We find that in some cities where there are worker councils, they're complaining about the parks and the so-called luxury gardens in the more affluent neighborhoods and why those aren't being used for cultivation. The German government attempted to arbitrate inequalities with ration cards. You would get your ration card and price controls. And there were regulations that controlled every phase of agricultural production in Germany. We find those similar regulations too in the Ottoman Empire, but regulations were pretty ineffective in the face of disaster. In 1915, there is a locust plague of biblical proportions in Greater Syria, which was already suffering near famine conditions. So these voracious insects just made it worse. They stripped vineyards, croplands, orchards, food markets were bare. Here we see an olive tree, one of these before and after pictures. So before locusts, after locusts. We know how bad it was because Jerusalem lacked the olive oil to even light the temples. People actually resorted to eating roasted locusts or burning the husks of locusts to heat their home ovens. In the United States, rather than enforce food rationing like we see happening in countries in Europe, we had a U.S. Food Administrator, Herbert Hoover, who encouraged citizens to eat less. There'd be these slogans, food will win the war, or like this one we see here, food is ammunition. And in a lot of ways it worked. We find there was a 15% or so reduction in domestic food consumption. The government would mail out pamphlets to homes, to homeowners that offered instructions on how one could, for example, dry vegetables and can them. And those often included several recipes to turn dry food into a delightful meal, such as we see here with this inviting dish of dried carrots. That they continued to send out pamphlets of how to dry food and have delicious meals like this image here tells us that most people were probably not altogether enticed with meals like dried carrots. But there are other interesting images that come out of this in the United States on how to best preserve. These are some of the best images I've seen when it comes to just the different aspects of this First World War that you might necessarily think of. This is also coming out of the U.S. This is about saving sugar, so canning all those fruits with the U.S. preserves, and here's Mrs. Patriot there in the front as a tree. Or encouraging people on how they prepare their food. So to bake, boil, broil more, fry less, save those fats for the fighters.
Professor, where would the general public see these kinds of ads and propaganda?
Oh, they would be in newspapers, they would be in magazines, they'd be in flyers that would be sent home. We also find that there'd be local community clubs that would also distribute these sorts of materials.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it was pervasive, even sorts of things like putting those kids to school to work. So in recess, they could all here work together in what began to be called war gardens, which became a pretty popular movement. Herbert Hoover also called upon patriotic Americans to participate in events like Meatless Mondays or Wheatless Wednesdays. They must have liked alliteration, but it worked. That contributed to that reduction in food consumption. There was a group that was established that was called the National War Garden Commission in the United States. And I'm offering examples here from the US, but we find similar organizations throughout all the belligerent countries. And these organizations are encouraging citizens to cultivate gardens in their backyards or vacant lots or in city parks. All of it was couched in terms of national security. So here's this little cartoon of these couple little boys, right? You know, when they're plowing up the little league fields, that it's gotten serious here in the United States. Or just strange ads like this one, war gardens over the top. And here we find that vegetables have been mobilized for war. There's the farmer in the background with the hoe that is being used as a weapon now. So there's a militarization of gardening and farming that's taking place here. For this, every garden a munition plant. So how food and agriculture is getting framed becomes very important during the First World War. By 1917, the War Garden Commission reported the cultivation of nearly 3 million gardens, which provided more than $500 million in crop value. By the end of the war, 25% of American households had what were popularly called war gardens. But the incentives for mass production were large. The US government guaranteed wheat prices of over $2 a bushel for the duration of the war, which was really high at the time. And given at this time with adequate rainfall, these soaring wheat prices, bountiful harvests created bonanza farms on the prairies where optimistic farmers would borrow heavily, often through a second mortgage, to break sod on marginal lands that they hadn't farmed before in order to reap those profits. Most of this was done across those wide grasslands, which were especially suited to gas-powered tractors, plows, and combines. Wheat farming was so lucrative during the First World War that the financial profits outweighed the environmental costs. But the ecological and economic consequences of that distorted agricultural production were severe. We think back to how quickly some of those lands in Europe appeared to recover. And what we also find happening is that Europe's agricultural yields approached their pre-war levels within just a few years after the conflict. What that meant is that for US farmers, grain prices plummeted by over 50% between 1920 and 1921, which created serious liquidity problems. That combination of drought, the evaporation of European demand, left hundreds of thousands of farmers destitute. That mechanized approach that had been taken to many in digging up that sod also left this fine layer of grit and dust, which later some have argued contributed to the Dust Bowls in the 1920s. So I'll pause there for a moment to see if there's any questions I can answer before I hop, skip, and jump to the next spot.
We do have a lot of questions actually queued up. Thank you, Professor, and I'd like to bring these to you now. And I think it's pretty fascinating, this last image in particular, where it's so easy, I think, for young people to imagine history as being something that starts when you turn the page to that chapter, and I'm obviously using more conventional language here, and that it concludes when that chapter is done, without seeing that the truly interconnectedness of all of time and space and change over time and space. So,
Right.
just even the implication that this kind of harvesting would then lead to the Dust Bowl is a that's a pretty remarkable thing, I think, for a young person to realize, that cause and effect.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of questions, and I'm going to get to them in no particular order.
Sure.
Maybe some order. Let's see. Let's go first. Let's go first to Ida. Ida is joining us from Los Angeles. Ida is wondering if there's a rough estimate of the total natural resources used in World War I.
Whoa, boy, that's a good question. That's one that I'm trying to answer too, and it's so difficult. One, because this war did span continents, and there's not necessarily a consistency in how those records were kept. And in some instances, those records have been lost to time or just weren't that accurately kept. But yeah, to even see just a snippet of that would be, I think, fascinating.
Thank you. As a follow-up question, this comes from Brian. Brian is in Norway, Maine. He's wondering if there was any either explicit or implied difference in the ways that countries with a capitalist economy handle this versus one with a not capitalist, whatever that might mean. Did the fact that there was private enterprise in any way bear some kind of impact on what you're describing?
Yeah, what we find, great question, thank you. What we find happening, these all are, I'm really enjoying the questions, is in the First World War, we find a tremendous amount of interaction between public agencies and private companies to an extent that we really hadn't seen before. in an effort to, for example, manage resources like coal, like oil, like timber, and food, like agriculture. So where we might not have seen this prior to in these capitalist economies, we see this now that it's an extensive amount of cooperation that's going into this creation of new agencies that are looking specifically at food for the war, or looking at specifically at oil production for the war. That's a marriage that in some ways didn't quite work out that great. It wasn't given that amount of time to really cement itself, but laid the groundwork for similar sorts of organizations and approaches in the Second World War.
Got it. Thank you. This question comes from Mike. Mike is wondering if any of the shells that are still found in the ground in Europe today, are they gas shells? And if so, is the gas still potent?
Yes and yes. There are indeed gas shells that still come up, and oftentimes the gas is still potent. It's part of that testing that all those shells to go through to determine if it is a gas shell or not. And yep, the gas can still kill.
And then as a follow-up question, Douglas is in nearby North Carolina, or here in North Carolina with me. Douglas asks if there is any effect did the poison gas have any effect on the ecology of northern France?
Not as much. So long as it was either contained within a shell, then we don't find that much leakage happening into the soil. If it had been used in warfare, would the shell actually function as it was supposed to? The gas would dissipate relatively quickly, that is to say, relative on an ecological scale. Horrible for the soldiers there, and it might linger in the trenches for days, but otherwise wouldn't have a lasting impact, say, on the food grown there.
Great, thank you. This question comes from Jessamine. Jessamine's in Napa Valley, California. Jessamine's wondering, this must be in response to something you said earlier, so I'm going to read it as it's posed. And Tate, if you can't quite figure out what Jessamine's referring to, then I'm going to ask her to resubmit the question. She's asking, what are the areas that are not accessible? What term did you use, Professor, to describe those, and how big are they?
Oh, red zones, or forbidden territory along those lines. But generally, they're called red zones. They're slowly becoming smaller, so they're not quite as extensive as we might imagine, but they're still pretty significant that they're there at all. We might think in terms of probably like state park sizes, like a northeastern state park sort of size that we'd have kind of polka dotted around the eastern areas of France and into Belgium.
Great, thank you. I'm going to swing back to Mike, not because he asked a question, but because he made a comment that I wonder if you can maybe expand on a little bit. Mike notes in the audience chat that he's always thought about victory gardens, but he's never heard of war gardens. Talk to us about the difference between those terms.
Yeah, that's great comment. When during the war, when this War Garden Commission started up, they did indeed frame it as war. After the war, they changed them to either peace gardens or more commonly victory gardens. And then the war gardens changed its approach, saying, well, we had once maintained these foods for victory. Now that we've obtained victory, now these foods will be for peace. So they made a quick turn there once the war had ended to maintain some sort of presence still, even though the war had ended.
Great. Thank you. These next questions are a little bit more in depth. Again, please take your time to answer them. We've got about 35 minutes left, so plenty of time to really dig in and go in the directions that our audience is interested in. This question comes from Jack. Jack is in Sarasota, Florida. He's wondering if there was, in the context of the war itself and or post-war period, were there a lot of complex policy negotiations between allies and countries? How much of this was actually negotiated production? How much of it was, sort of expected in a very formal agreement kind of way?
Mm. Yes, there were extensive agreements and debates that were happening here, or policy that was being formed in terms of tonnage of food supplied, tonnage of resources supplied. The catch was getting it over to Europe, not only because of the German U-boat threat, but just in terms of actual available space on refrigerated frigates to take frozen meat over to the British and the French soldiers. It was, there were attempts to quantify all of that in terms of how much would be sent over, how much would be paid, that sort of thing. It was also a concern that there would be profiteers out there who would attempt to use this to their advantage, hence the attempted cooperation between the public and the private to prevent that sort of thing. But we do see that because of those negotiations, or because of that need that European armies had for food, mostly coming from the Americas, that actually it gave some leverages to countries where we hadn't seen it before. For example, Argentina, that supplied most of the protein and quite a lot of the wheat products to the British and the French. And the British figured, well, the Argentinians need our coal. That was part of the exchange. And so we'll use that to our advantage to get really low prices on these meats. But the reverse ended up being true, that the Argentina can use the British demand for meat and then just simply get its coal from the United States. So there was a lot of moving parts here and a lot of resketching out of geopolitical relationships.
Yeah, fantastic. As a follow-up or maybe an extension question, this comes from Beth. Beth is located in Atlanta, Georgia. Was this production and the environmental impact of the war in any way used in reparation requests? In other words, did the losers have to pay prices for this kind of both short and long-term damage?
Yeah, they did. As part of the reparations that Germany and Austria were required to pay under the peace treaties, that included restoration of agricultural lands and restoration of forests, particularly in those war zones. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. This comes from Jennifer. Jennifer's in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and she'd like you to talk some about the human impact of World War I, meaning, I think, displacement, immigration, migration. Certainly we're seeing this in Ukraine today. This is true in all warfare. Civilians flee, and the impact of them fleeing is significant, both in terms of the pathways they take as well as wherever they wind up. So talk to us a little bit about the impact of the people who were displaced in World War I.
Yeah, and if I may, that's a great segue to talking about what's happening in Africa. In a lot of ways, Africa doesn't get that much attention in the scholarship, or maybe it'll catch a paragraph here and there. There's not that many books about the war in Africa. But to my mind, the First World War in Africa was far more devastating than it was in Europe. And a lot of that has to do with massive population displacement and famine that's happening across most of the continent. So there are pretty severe energy deficits and famine in Africa. And what we find is that because pack animals would fall prey by the thousands to the tsetse fly, that fly is the biological vector for the parasite that causes sleeping sickness. So for European troops, energy reserves there were African bodies. That is to say, both sides carried out their campaigns on the backs of Africans. Millions of Africans were mobilized across the colonial holdings there. For example, the British recruited over 1 million porters for its East African campaign, where a lot of the sustained fighting was taking place. And those Africans are drawn from populations all across sub-Saharan Africa.
Great, thank you, Tate.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, it's 5 minutes of 8. Why don't we go ahead and move forward with your concluding slides, and we'll save the rest of the questions when you're done.
Sure. Let me skip ahead. The only other place I was going to mention was Cuba. No one thinks about Cuba in the First World War, but in fact, Cuba was there. Cuba joined the United States in declaring war on Germany when war was declared. The real issue there was food. Cuba has really fertile soil, but it's used for sugar. And the profits from sugar, with these huge sugar centrals, that's for Hershey, far outweighed any attempts to turn those lands to agricultural output. So we find a tremendous amount of unrest there in Cuba. In fact, the U.S. Marines were sent in until 1917 to guarantee the sugar supply. But to get to my last slides, I like to reference this guy, Kurt Levin, who was a German psychologist. He was also an artillery officer during the First World War, and he'd been wounded. And when he was recovering, he wrote a book about about the perceptions of landscapes. And what he begins talking about is the difference between peace landscapes and war landscapes, where peace landscapes are boundless, they extend out as far as the eye can see. War landscapes were directed, they're contained, they're bordered by violence and destruction. And so what we find, though, is from an environmental perspective, that boundary between peace landscape and war landscapes becomes pretty blurred, right? So here's this image we have of the Western Front here along the Great Plains, where we see this massive erosion caused by extensive farming. Here from the Pacific Northwest, which in some ways looks really similar to what we see in northern France. These explosions that are happening here in the trenches, explosions that were happening there in Mexico with the extraction of oil. And what I find is that all these efforts to extract natural resources extended state or corporate control over the natural world in some way. And that Western Europe was pretty heavily dependent on its dominions or former dominions to maintain its war efforts, which is to say, in a lot of ways, looking at this war, it was these settler societies or former settler societies that maintained Europe's war effort. And in turn, these settler societies used imperial energy needs to further extend systems of colonial control over frontier lands and indigenous populations. It reinforced state building projects that had begun in the 19th century through dispossession, subjugation, segregation. So when we look at that from an environmental perspective, we find that these imperial energy demands intensified the war, brought their own violence that turned supposed peace lands, places far from the battlefields, into war lands. And in that sense, the legacy of that violence continued long after the armistice. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions that have queued up, and again, I'm going to remind the audience to submit formal questions in the Ask the Professor tab, and I'll bring them forward as the moderator. A couple of the next questions are going to be, I think, more about that impact that you've talked, that you've walked us through tonight. The first question is actually a comment that I saw Cindina make earlier, and I'm going to frame it into a question because I think it was really, a pretty lovely observation. Cindina's in Southern California as well. Talk to us about how everything you've described led or didn't lead to the conservation efforts of the United States in the 30s and 40s and 50s. What kind of impact did what you've outlined have with that kind of environmental necessity that came to be?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. I think in a lot of ways, the First World War was critical for the conservation movement. As armies and militaries and planners realized that at this scale of industrial warfare, you have to come up with a sustainability plan. And that meant inviting nature conservation agencies into the discussions and into the political scene, where prior to they'd been kind of kept out of those discussions. And so there is a sense of legitimacy then that gets conferred on these agencies. This is happening in the US, but it's also happening in France and Great Britain and Germany, among other places. So conservation then becomes couched in national security, and thereby giving the strength to calls for conserving forests, for conserving wetlands.
And if you can, while I understand you're a World War I scholar, can you speak at all to how these lessons were either learned or continued to be ignored during World War II?
Well, in a lot of ways, World War I was a dress rehearsal. And in terms of governments figuring out how it is that you manage these natural resources, how you work between public agencies and private corporations with specialty groups to coordinate all this extraction and all those logistics. They kind of stumbled their way through it during the First World War. In the Second World War, they were much better prepared to figure out how those dynamics would play out and operate at a much, much larger scale.
Thank you. I'm going to swing back around to the topic of reparations in response to William's question. William's joining us from Illinois. He's always thought that reparations are strictly monetary, but were there other forms of reparations like land repair or food or resources of other kinds?
Yeah, not necessarily food, but not just money. There was also the idea of either finished goods or raw materials. The French got so impatient with the Germans dragging their heels that they occupied parts of Germany in the 1920s, mostly in the Ruhr Valley, to ensure that they were getting the industrial products, mostly the steel and iron, that had been promised to them in the peace treaties. So it wasn't just money; it was also goods, more goods than it was services.
And Carolyn reminds us that these reparations and restitutions also fueled the tensions that could perhaps, led to the Second World War, particularly in Germany. Talk to us a little bit about that relationship.
I think so. I think the Treaty of Versailles overshadowed the Weimar democracy in a lot of ways. I would be hesitant to draw a straight line from reparations to the Second World War, but it certainly played a role in the rhetoric of far-right parties, not only the Nazis, but especially the Nazis, in decrying the Weimar Republic as inadequate, as weak, as not really standing up for the German nation. And they could easily point to the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations, which universally in Germany were seen as overly harsh.
Thank you. This question comes from Sean. Sean is in Los Angeles, and he asks, how has American, I'm sorry, Sean, let me try again, Tate. How has America shifted from producers to consumers, made the country vulnerable amid a future conflict, either as a direct participant or as a witness?
Oh, run that by me again. So the transition.
Yeah, and you can also, whoops, I just deleted it, unfortunately. How has, Sean, I'm going to do this from memory now, and so if I get it wrong, put it back in the ask.
Oh, I see it.
Got it?
How has American shift from producers to consumers? Yeah, I see. maybe, but what I think I think we find the war is, or the world today is it's much more tightly bound than say it was during the First World War. In a lot of ways, right, when we talk about globalization or global warfare, we certainly see that with the First World War. But now we've gotten to such a place so far different from the First World War, even just in terms of transport. So we think now the jets we can use to ship food here and there, that we don't necessarily have to rely just on ships crossing oceans. And the technology that we had today that we didn't have then, I think puts a different spin on all of that. So I'm hesitant to say vulnerable in terms of agricultural production. I think far more vulnerable in terms of technological issues.
Thank you. Next question comes from Mary. Mary's in Montana. I don't know. It's great to have I don't think I've ever called someone out from Montana. It's a great question. Mary is wondering if you can extend the impact that you're describing from short-term to more longer-term, even 20th century term impact. I mean, environmental damage, ecological impact, generational change of location and wealth and access. These are long-term trends. So can you extend your work into the late 20th century or even currently?
Yeah, I think so. I think the biggest impact of all of this comes from the industrialized approach to war and the industrialized approach to the projection of power. So that projection of power abroad, and maybe we can think of it if we're looking for an example, like a simple example is just thinking about sending a nuclear missile from the U.S. over to wherever, right? Soviet Union, if we imagine like the height of the Cold War sort of thing. So that projection of power takes an extensive network of energy extraction, of political will, governmental oversight, private corporations, all of that contributing to this war mentality of how one extracts natural resources. I think it's this industrialized warfare mindset that is the lasting effect of the First World War in terms of ecological impact.
And certainly that becomes amplified during wartime. But would you also suggest that same environmental impact, which is largely invisible to us as consumers and kind of daily citizens, is that true of virtually every policy, of every major national decision that has this kind of impact?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it is, because what happens then is with that projection comes with it also, right, the cloaking. So, right, we could just go to the grocery store and get our food and for the most part have no idea where any of that has come from. So there's this disconnect now that takes place, I think, precisely because of the industrialized and the globalized aspect of the entire agricultural market. And really with anything.
We did a great webinar last fall with Chris Jones, who's a historian in Arizona State, on energy policy of the 20th century, and he really does sort of underscore that point. And his is largely in sort of domestic policy and and the ways that energy and the consumption of energy and the production of energy affects all of our lives all of the time in these kind of invisible hand kind of way.
Oh yeah.
I think what you're offering is this kind of magnified example during warfare for sure.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit. This question's for me. Talk to us a little bit about how teachers, we've got an audience full of educators who, again, have access to kind of a very traditional narrative of Lusitania to Versailles and
Right.
move on, got other things to cover.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit from your perspective as an educator about why it's important to offer this kind of 360-degree view of this just absolutely colossal event at the beginning of the century.
Yeah, I think what got me started along this path is I guess this goes back to, that one of those first questions you posed to me, whether we say the First World War or World War One. And then what came to my mind is, well, why do we use world? Like, what made it a world war? And I think by extending it beyond just looking at the sinking of the Lusitania and then signing of the Treaty of Versailles, to really understand how this war touched on people's daily lives. People really far away from the war in France, a farmer on the Canadian or the American prairies, or a tin miner over in Malaysia, or a porter down in East Africa. These sort of ordinary people, so to speak, are still feeling the impact of this conflict. And I think putting it in a broader global framework helps us see beyond just a kind of country to country to country approach.
And while conflict is sometimes unavoidable and sometimes the best course of action, it also really clearly underlines the consequences of deciding for conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
This question comes from Duke. Duke is at the Macaulay School in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Duke is wondering if you have some favorite archives or places where you found all these wonderful images. Where do you go to get your source material?
One of the places that I found most accessible is the Library of Congress. They've done a great job of digitalizing more information, or increasing amount of information that is available out there. The Hoover Institute also has materials that one can find. I think that's still housed at Stanford. Those two are what immediately come to mind. And increasingly, and I think this is part or legacy of the centennial, a number of different national archives. The British National Archive, for example, the Australian National Archive is another one, put huge efforts behind digitalizing or otherwise making accessible materials from the First World War, like across the board, all kinds of different things.
Great. This question comes from Jody. Jody's in Southern California and wonders, sometimes when we make arguments or conduct research and inquiry, some of the most important criticisms are the things that help us fine-tune that. Professor, what kinds of criticisms have you received for this approach? Is there any? What would you say is the most valid, the thing that really helped you fine-tune this work that you were working on at the center?
I'll tell you the one that stuck with me the most, and I'm so very, very grateful for it. And this speaks not only to my project, I think it speaks to the scholarship of the First World War as a whole, but also the entire approach that most Westerners take to history. I gave talks about this project in India, and one of the historians there made an observation on how Eurocentric of approach I was taking, and how I emphasized that the war had an impact in Africa, and I talked about the war's impact in India, but I did it through a European gaze that I didn't even realize I was doing. And so when he brought that to my attention, I thought, oh yeah, it's totally what I'm doing. So it's important then, I think, for historians here in the US, for historians who are working in Europe, to understand the colonial gaze they might be taking towards the documents themselves, the primary sources themselves, and making sure they're questioning themselves about what sort of gaze it is that they're taking about these materials, which in turn shapes how they're viewing and talking about the conflict. So I think there's a broader need for decolonizing the approach to the First World War, since so much of the scholarship is dominated, particularly British and the French and Americans.
Professor Keller, thank you so much for walking us through this story and this narrative tonight, providing these resources and being generous with the answers to our questions. We're going to conclude just a little bit early tonight. You know why, Tate? It's spring break. And
yeah.
They're ready to go get their flip-flops on, so we're going to conclude just a little bit earlier than normal. I want to thank everybody for being here. Tate, thank you for joining us once again.
Thank you so very much. Thanks, everyone.
And again, I want to thank everyone in our audience for joining tonight's webinar. Please do follow the National Humanities Center and our social media and our website. Please open those newsletters because we have a lot of new opportunities that we're constantly sharing and inviting you to be a part of. I also want to welcome you and invite you to the webinar. We've got 4 more left. April 19th is the next one. I'll be joined by Kimberly Hamlin. Kimberly was a speaker last year, actually, on she joined us for a webinar, and just a wonderful speaker, wonderful historian. She'll be sharing her work on putting the Me Too movement in historical context. Have a great day at school tomorrow. If you're in school, go enjoy spring break. Stop thinking about history for a little while. We'll see you next time, April 15th, the Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.